The Mona Lisa in Paris has been staring at us for over 500 years. She doesn't speak or move, but somehow she never stops asking questions. Millions of people visit her every year. Some see beauty, some see mystery, and very few ask the real question, who was the man who painted her? Leonardo da Vinci is often considered an artist, but he was also an engineer, a scientist, an inventor, and an anatomist. He drew machines that wouldn't exist for centuries and studied the human body with a level of detail that modern medicine would later admire. He tried to make the man fly. When he died, many of his notebooks disappeared. Some say the answers to his greatest questions were lost forever, but others believe the real mystery wasn't what he left behind. It was how one man could think so far ahead of his time. This is the epic story of the greatest artist ever, Leonardo da Vinci.
My name is Leonardo da Vinci. In the 1490s, I lived in Milan, employed by the Duke as a painter and engineer. The city saw me as an artist, but in truth, I saw myself as a student devoted to the study of nature. To portray the human figure on canvas, it required an understanding of how the body moved, how it breathed. Every muscle, every joint, every nerve had meaning. To create great art, we must begin with anatomy. But anatomy slowly turned into an obsession for me. I was very drawn to the male body because of its structure, balance, and proportion. I never found myself aligned with the ideals of heterosexual passion. I once wrote in my notebook, "The sexual act and the body parts involved in it are so repulsive that if it were not for the beauty of the faces, the species would perish." In my youth, during the 1470s in Florence, I was accused of engaging in relations with a male prostitute. The charge was serious and could have ended my life, but my father held influence, and thanks to his connections, the accusations were dismissed. In Milan, 1490, I found companionship in a young man named Salai. He arrived in my studio as a wild child. Over the years, he became my assistant and my muse. I sketched him repeatedly, not out of affection alone, but because his form captivated my sense of proportion and detail. My notebooks became filled with anatomy questions. I peeled flesh off the faces of cadavers, delineated the muscles that moved the lips, and then painted the world's most memorable smile. In 1489, I began dissecting human skulls, tracing the architecture of the head and noting the cavities behind the eyes. I studied the proportional relationships between different parts of the body, believing that geometry could explain the form of man. The ancient Roman architect Vitruvius had described the concept over 1,000 years earlier, and several artists had attempted to illustrate it. So I tried too. I set out to show that the ideal human body could fit perfectly within both a circle and a square. The result was not just a diagram, it was a revelation. The Vitruvian man was a blend of science and art, of mathematics and anatomy. It was a statement that the structure of the human being mirrored the structure of the universe. Years later, in 1508, at the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova, I met an old man who claimed he had lived over 100 years without ever falling ill. A few hours later, he passed away quietly in his bed. I requested to examine his body, hoping to understand what had allowed him to live so long, and why his life had ended so peacefully. During the dissection, I noticed his arteries were dry, narrowed, and almost withered. They carried little blood. Later, I compared his vessels with those of a 2-year-old child who had died the same night. The contrast was stunning. The child's arteries were supple, wide, and full of vitality. In my notes, I described the difference through analogy. The network of vessels behaves in man as in oranges. The peel becomes tougher, and the pulp diminishes with age. My discoveries did not stop there. I became fascinated by the heart, dissecting it again and again. I described its valves, its chambers, and the way it controlled the flow of blood through the body. To me, the heart was not only a biological organ, it was a key to the mystery of life. We understand that curiosity is a gift until it becomes a curse. Once a question entered my mind, it just refused to leave. I needed a way to capture them, to organize the chaos. That is why I began writing and taking notes, sketching everything I observed. Paper was expensive, so I filled every inch of it. One corner might hold a study of the human hand, another, a flying machine. Sometimes lists of questions. Why does a yawn spread from one person to another? What moves the eye? What causes sleep? I never attended a Latin school, so I wrote in the language I spoke, Italian. I was left-handed, so I wrote from right to left in a mirror script. Many of my notebooks disappeared over time, lost, sold, or scattered, but some survived. They were never meant to be read by others. Yet in those pages, more than in any painting or invention, lives the truest version of who I was. When I was still an infant in my cradle, a bird named Kite descended from the sky and brushed my lips with its tail. That vision, whether real or imagined, stayed with me. Perhaps it was a beginning. I was born in 1452 as an illegitimate son of a notary in Benci, a small town near Florence. Because of my birth, I was never sent to a Latin school. Instead, I studied at an abacus school where I learned the basics of arithmetic, geometry, and practical knowledge. But it was nature that truly educated me. As a child, I became fascinated with birds. I watched them endlessly. I sketched them constantly, trying to understand their structure, the secrets hidden in the curve of a feather or the hollow of a bone. One day, while wandering the hills of Tuscany, I discovered a cave. At first, I hesitated, afraid of what might be inside. But curiosity pulled me in. There, embedded in the rock, I found the fossil of a whale. A sea creature frozen in stone high in the mountains. That discovery challenged everything I had been told about the world. It taught me that nature holds its truths in silence, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Years later, in Milan, I designed mechanical wings and aerial contraptions. Some were built for theatrical grand spectacles in ducal courts, where angels could descend from the ceiling on wires and pulleys. But I also designed flying machines meant for real flight, ornithopters with flapping wings. All of them are drawn by hand, built from careful observation of birds and wind. I studied the anatomy of birds as I had studied the human body, how muscles flexed in flight, how bones were hollow to reduce weight. I filled pages with sketches and measurements, trying to translate the miracle of flight into machines that could carry a man into the sky. But I never achieved it. I never flew. Still, I believed that one day perhaps someone else would finish what I began. When I left Florence as an adult for Milan in the early 1480s, I did not bring a reputation. I brought a letter. In that letter, addressed to Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, I made bold claims. I wrote of bridges that could be deployed swiftly, of cannons that would cut through enemy lines with precision, of armored chariots with scythed wheels that could strike fear into armies. 10 paragraphs of war machines. Only in the final lines did I mention that I could also paint. In truth, I had never built these machines. They existed only in my mind and in the drawings that filled my notebooks. But I believed in the power of imagination, especially in times of conflict. I hoped Milan might give those visions shape. Instead, the Duke commissioned me for murals, stage designs, and sculptures. My machines of war remained sketches on parchment. Some were fantastical, multi-barreled cannons, siege ladders, even submarines. But they were not entirely dreams. I drew them with precision, measuring gear ratios and pressure systems, imagining materials and movement. I believed that technology could shape the future of warfare, not just through destruction, but through design. I returned to Florence around the year 1500. 2 years later, I found myself in the service of Cesare Borgia, a ruthless man with a vision for power that matched my own ambition for invention. Under Borgia's, I became a military engineer. I was given freedom to survey fortresses and design strategies. During this time, I created the Map of Imola, a city under Borgia's control. It was unlike any map drawn before, precise, aerial, geometric. I used a water-powered odometer of my own design to measure distances, and I marked every road, wall, and turning. That map was revolutionary. It gave commanders the power to see the battlefield as a whole, not just as fragments. It was architecture in service of war. I built a few machines of war, but I imagined many. I fought no battles, but I drew the future. Above everything else in my life, I was a painter. I began as a boy in Florence, apprenticed to the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, a man of discipline and excellence in Florence. I was sent there at the age of 14. Verrocchio was a sculptor, a goldsmith, and an engineer. I learned there how to paint and how to think with my hands, how to observe. He taught me perspective, proportion, and the discipline to revise endlessly. One of my earliest portraits was of a young Florentine noblewoman named Ginevra da Benci. She was barely 17, sharp-witted, educated, and composed beyond her years. In a time when portraits often flattered with idealized beauty, I chose a different path. I painted her as she was, restrained, serene, real. Her gaze met the viewer head-on, steady, unflinching. She did not smile. Behind her, I placed a juniper bush. Juniper stood for chastity and virtue, qualities Ginevra was known for. Ginevra was not merely a subject. She was the beginning of a new kind of portraiture, inward, intimate, and alive. Years later, I moved to Milan in 1482. I had written a letter to the Duke of Milan. I was sent to decorate court festivals and paint portraits, and I did. But there, in the convent of Santa Maria, I undertook a commission that would define me. The commission was to paint the Last Supper on the wall of the dining hall at the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. It was a traditional scene depicted in religious institutions, usually showing Jesus sharing his final meal with his apostles. However, I wanted to capture something more profound. I chose to illustrate the exact moment when Christ declares, "One of you will betray me." I wanted to capture the emotional reaction of each apostle. Thomas points upward in protest. Peter leans forward, clutching a knife, and Judas recoils into the shadows, his hand clenched around a small purse. To achieve this level of detail, I refused to use the traditional fresco technique, which requires painting quickly on wet plaster. Instead, I experimented with a mixture of oil and tempera on dry plaster. This method allowed me to work slowly, to build layers of emotion and refine every detail. I incorporated my understanding of geometry and optics to construct the illusion of depth. I used linear perspective with a single vanishing point located at the head of Christ. The architecture of the room, its walls, tapestries, and ceiling beams all converge toward him, drawing the viewer's gaze to his calm expression. I wanted the observer to feel as though they were present in the room, witnessing the moment of revelation. The work took me nearly 3 years to complete. I painted slowly, sometimes obsessively, and often paused for long periods of reflection. In 1498, I laid down my brush. The painting was finished. In my last years, I painted less and observed more. My body began to fail me. My right hand grew weak from a stroke, but my mind remained as restless as ever. In 1516, at the age of 64, I accepted an invitation from King Francis I of France. I packed my notebooks, my sketches, and 3 of my favorite paintings, St. John the Baptist, the Virgin, and Child with St. Anne, and the one that never left my side, La Gioconda. The French king gave me a manor in Amboise, the Château de Clos-Lucé, just a short walk from his court. There I spent my final years painting occasionally, designing festivals, and discussing philosophy and science with those who would listen. But always, I returned to the canvas, always. I returned to her. I had painted wars, saints, and betrayal, but she was none of those things. She was Lisa del Giocondo, the wife of a Florentine merchant. I began this portrait in 1503 in Florence, but not as a commission, but as an inquiry into beauty behind the eyes. I kept the panel with me for years, from Florence to Milan in 1507, from Rome to France. I painted her slowly, layer upon layer, pigment upon thought. Unlike others, she was not born in weeks or months. She was distilled over 17 years. Her smile is not a mystery, it is precision. I studied the movement of the lips, how muscles tighten and curve, how the light breaks across the skin. I dissected cadavers to understand how emotion is formed beneath flesh. I used sfumato, the technique I invented to erase the line between form and air. There are no edges in nature, only transitions. Her eyes do not follow you, they remain still. It is the world that moves around her, and her gaze, it unsettles even me. She looks not at you but through you, as if she knows your questions and has chosen not to answer them. She sits in a dreamscape, a strange, impossible background where rivers fade into mist and mountains seem carved not by geology, but by memory. She was never one woman. She became every discovery I ever made, in pigment, in proportion, in optics, in emotion. She was my science, my philosophy, my peace, my turmoil. In the end, I painted her to remember who I had been.
Leonardo da Vinci died on May 2, 1519, in the quiet gardens of Clos-Lucé, France. In his final days, he was surrounded not by crowds or acclaim, but by sketches, thoughts, and unfinished questions. He left behind a way of seeing the world. In the centuries that followed, others would find themselves walking in his shadow. Newton, who, like Leonardo, saw patterns hidden in the chaos of nature. Einstein, who called him a man infinitely ahead of his time. Because Leonardo da Vinci wasn't merely a man of the Renaissance, he was a glimpse of what the future could be, and perhaps still is. We're on a mission to build the most powerful storytelling channel on YouTube. If you seek the minds that shaped history, the obsessions, the brilliance, the beauty, join us, subscribe, and be part of the journey.